Hi. Where
Hi.
does this podcast find you?
I am in Brooklyn, New York, and just in my room here. Got a very simple setup. I've got my desk and a bed and just sort of do a little work. And yeah, it's a nice space. It's a nice sunny day. It's very cold out, but other than that, it's all good.
Awesome. Well, why don't we just get started and you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, what drives you, so we get to know you a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, my official name is Avram Alpert. I go by Avi. I teach writing at Princeton University. I teach first year writing, and I also run what we call the somewhat poorly named Interdisciplinary Art and Theory program. It looked really nice when we wrote it out, but it's a bit of a mouthful. And that's a free program in New York for artists and critics and curators who are in between things and want some more education. And then I write my own work. I write a lot about, I think, the intersection between the humanities and social sciences. I like to think about what the humanities can contribute to the social institutions, the political institutions, the relationships that we all have. And I try to think a lot about how my training, my interests in what we find valuable and meaningful in an interconnected and very complex world can contribute or lay down some frameworks, values for thinking about broader interactions. And I am trying to work in this space that I like to think of as kind of, it's not self-help really, it's kind of like social help. It's ways of thinking about what we can do, how we can think about ourselves that may have impacts in the broader world.
I love that, and your work has certainly made an impact on me, and we'll get to that in a little bit. One thing that I found so great when we first were actually talking in email, and I had reached out to you because I had written I've read some of your work that you'd written, and I reached out and you said, I don't really have a lot of experience with business, but I can talk about values. And I thought this was such a great response and sort of the encapsulation of why I started this podcast and why it's called Poets and Thinkers, because I think, in fact, in a lot of ways, we need to get back to bringing those two more together. And so I'm extremely excited that we get to talk. So, your book, well, one of your book, The Good Enough Life, actually found me more than I found it. I was on a walk in downtown Princeton, which we both know across the campus. There's this great bookstore, and it was outside on one of those tables, and it immediately caught my eye because it has a kintsugi bowl on the cover. And my love appreciation for kintsugi maybe is for another podcast, but it caught my eye. And then I started reading the first few pages, and it completely caught me really off guard almost, because you're describing a little bit of your own observation and struggles with greatness, and we'll get to that too. But I was hooked, and then made it through the book and left really inspired with more questions than answers, even more so. And so I'm so glad we get to talk. You told me also about an encounter that you had, going back to this whole, I don't have a lot of experience with business, but I can talk about values. You told me about an experience you had when you went to Hamburg for a writer's retreat, I believe, and you were talking to some business people. Tell me and us a little bit more about that, because I think it's a great jumping off point.
Sure. And I can say a little bit about the context. One of the things I like to appreciate and express is my own limitations and my own ignorance about different things. And so when I say I don't know that much about business, I don't know what it's like to run a business. I don't know what it's like to have people depend on you for their salaries, or to have your family depend on the success of your business. I don't know what it's like to work, if you're working at a bigger scale, what that could be like, and the kinds of decisions that you're making. So it's those kinds of things where I just don't want to pretend that I know about, the kinds of experiences that people are going through, even while, as someone who isn't working in businesses but obviously interacts with them all the time, I am affected by the decisions that businesses make, especially business leaders make. And so I do, as we all do, have our opinions about how those decisions might be made better, what kind of values might guide them. But I do want to recognize that obviously I am speaking from a somewhat outside position, and want to acknowledge that so that we can have, better dialogue across these fields. And one of the things that we tried to do in Hamburg, I was at a place called the New Institute, and I was there for a couple of years. One of the things they wanted to do was to bring people from the humanities and social sciences together to talk with people in business, in law, in economics, so that we didn't have too great a split. It was a really nice idea. It's not always that easy. It wasn't always that successful. But one of the things we would do is have these dinners, and various of us would go different nights. So I went one night, and I can't exactly remember the specifics of who was there, the different industries that people were in. But it was a very interesting experience for a number of reasons, and one of which was realizing some of this disjuncture between values and business that isn't unknown to business people, even ones who are working in, say, heavily polluting industries. So the person sitting next to me at the dinner was very aware that the profits that he made depended both on an unequal global structure, that he, extracted minerals from places in the global south and sold them at a profit in the north that mostly profited him, not the people doing the extraction. And also that whole process was incredibly inefficient and ecologically disastrous. It was just where the profit margins were. And he was completely aware of it. This was not me having to say, oh, but, what about the global economy? This was entirely from his perspective. And then I sort of asked him, well, we're here to talk about values and businesses. What do you think? And he said, I'm constrained. Like, this is the world that I live in. If I try to make a more ecological and more labor-friendly or more egalitarian, helps everyone involved in the process, my product at the end of the line will cost more and no one will buy it. And I think it was like one of these moments where you sort of just see that individuals matter, the choices we make, the things we care about really matter, but creating a business environment, design if we can, talking about kind of the structures, the laws, the ways in which these things are implemented, matter in the sense that they create the possibilities for us, or they constrain the possibilities for us. And that people who would do good in a system that promoted that good find themselves unable to. That's not to excuse what he winds up doing. It's not to sort of say there might not be other ways, or he might not be able to lobby in particular ways that he wasn't doing. But that it's not simply about like being the good ethical business person. It's about thinking about the relationship between your business and the broader environment, and what kinds of things are you advocating? Are you pushing for? Are you just sort of saying, I need deregulation so that I can make more profit? Or are you sort of saying, I need more regulation that's going to help me do the good thing because everyone else is going to have to do the right thing that we all know is going to benefit everyone. So that was quite interesting. I can keep talking about, there's lots of little tidbits that came out of the dinner. I think one of the others that sort of surprised me sometimes was we would, as the conversation advanced and we talked about kind of what would need to change systemically, one person sort of said, look, we've tried this. We've tried government regulation, we've tried more egalitarian societies, and we've seen that they impede growth, and we've seen that they, the worst side of it, they lead to a kind of totalitarianism, and that's just what happens. And I had to ask him, sitting on the other side of the table, so someone else was sort of shouting across the table, but as we had a general conversation, I just said, what are the ways that you think about businesses? If a business finds in its course of doing things that people have tried before to have transatlantic flights. People have tried before to have electric vehicles. People have tried before to develop personal computers that can fit all these, chips and small things, and everyone can have one, and they don't take up the size of a football field. And someone said to you, well, people have tried that before. It's just impossible. I don't think you would believe them. You would try to keep improving your product. And why don't we do the same thing with our societies, with our politics? There's no reason for us to think that we can't keep improving. And I do see that in lots of places where people will say, look, I think AI is going to change everything. These technological revolutions are going to change everything. Oh, but the capitalist system, winners and losers, bad externalities, ecological destruction, that's just the only thing we can do. I think, no, apply your own business thinking to how we do these things. And I think we can think much more broadly about what's possible and reasonable, and learn from each other some methods for that kind of improvement.
Yes, and I love both anecdotes for different reasons, but also because I think what you exposed in that question is exactly what I'm contemplating, and what I'm trying to explore in these conversations that I have with people from all different backgrounds, because seeing the capitalistic approach, right, focusing on maximizing capitalistic gain at all costs, is clearly not working for us, right? And even within the capitalistic system, it's not working for us. And then you add on top of that, social issues and, planetary issues, environment, all of that. And I think I love your provocation there of saying everywhere else in your innovation cycle, we employ those thought patterns of, hey, there must be a way, right? If it's not gated by the laws of physics, there must be a way. And just in this case, we actually don't, which probably brings us a little bit into your book. But before I make an interpretation of and kind of pull out a few pieces from the book that I thought were just outstanding, what motivated you writing particularly that book? Because I think it covers a lot of what you just touched on.
Yeah, I was interested in a lot of things as I was writing the book. And some of the argument of the book, just to sort of lay it out in general, is that we tend to think as a society that the best way for us to advance is to get always the smartest people in the room, the best whatever, the best chefs, the best athletes, the best musicians, the best business people, philosophers, whatever it might be, and give them all the resources. And if we give them all the resources, they'll do all the work for us. They'll come up with the best things, and it'll sort of trickle down to us, and we'll have all the what we need, and it'll be fine. They'll get fabulously wealthy, but it'll be the best for everyone. And I think that that's both. I understand the argument, and I can see how sometimes things may work out that way. But in general, I think it's both kind of practically incorrect and morally incorrect. And I think from a practical perspective, it's simply the case that all of the things that we have that really matter for us are because lots of people got involved in them. So even if we see one great athlete doing his or her best or their best on the field, it's because there were people who built the field, who mowed it, who made it possible to get there through roads and electricity and transport, and brought in all the materials and brought in the concessions and grew the food and all these things. And that we only look at this one point, this kind of like final person doing the performing, instead of looking at everything around it. And so what I wanted to do was shift our perspective a little bit to everything around it. And what would it mean to think about our goals and our values and our ideals in society as recognizing the ways that all of us contributed, as opposed to just the great ones, all of us good enough people. And so I think some of that came from a sense that there was this increasing in all fields. And I wrote it a lot about the economy and about how we think about nature and parenting and so forth. But it began, as a lot of things I think do, just in my own immediate world. And looking at how people who work as artists or writers or thinkers, there were narrower and narrower paths to that kind of life, and that it was being reserved for a fewer and fewer sort of select few who were deemed great. And these great few got all the gallery shows, all the museum shows, all the book deals, all the big lectures and so forth. And it did not in any way track onto the available contributions that many more people could be making in those fields. And I would see the same artists again and again, even though knowing that there were hundreds of others quality artists out there who were not getting any recognition or respect. And I think that that mapped very much onto what we saw in a lot of the, I began writing the book in, thinking about it around 2017, 2018, where alongside a lot of political upheaval, we were seeing that people were feeling disenfranchised and left out and like their voices didn't matter. And I wanted to, in a sense, understand where people were coming from and what had led them to support, say, a candidate talking about greatness, but why that impulse actually came from somewhere else, right? That what they wanted was to be heard and recognized and part of something, and thought that maybe someone could give that to them. And I wanted to effectively disagree with that interpretation and really sort of say, look, let's look at the world together. Let's see what happens. I'm not telling you you're wrong about your life or what's going on or what's frustrating you at all. That's not my place. But I am asking if we're both seeing this disconnect, this loss of appreciating the ordinary qualities of our lives, the goodness, the care, the decency, all the things that matter, how might that connect up to a broader interpretation that has less to do with saviors and leaders and much more to do with an increase in democratic participation, equality, openness, different ways of relating to each other? And how might that also be really healthy for all of us? I was also watching a lot of people burn out in this process of trying to make it to the top and seeing that this really isn't good or healthy for anyone, regardless of where they wind up in this kind of system of greatness. So arguing instead for good enough, for decency, for well-being, and for all of us.
Yeah, one of the things that probably got me hooked was at the very beginning, I think one of the first few pages, you talk about your own kind of examination, radical inquiry on what was driving your personal striving for greatness. And I read that, and it was basically reading my own inner dialogue for the majority of my life. And, I want to ask you about what do you actually, before we, go into all the other things, I want to ask you how do you define greatness? Because I think that's important. And then, of course, also as it relates to that, how do you define good enough? But I think I also want to talk about, and I don't know if you want to do it in the context of this, that's why I'm bringing it up, about what often underlies this striving for greatness. Because I think you already touched on the societal reward system and incentive structure that's built.
Yeah.
And then there's an internal part to that too. I don't know, you can take it in any which order, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. The way I start the book is thinking again, about myself. How can I be humble here? How can I, kind of talk about my own role, my own place? What do I know? And from a young age, I think like most of people, you look around the world and you want to see how you can kind of be respected and appreciated and part of something. And you see that the people who excel tend to receive that adoration and recognition. And this is actually a theory, as an aside, that I take from Adam Smith in his moral philosophy, where he talks quite extensively about this is how we develop. And he also finds that we put too much value on greatness. But what I mean in the sense of greatness there is not excellence. It's not being really immersed or pursuing your craft. It's not being excited about something and trying to do it as well as you can. It's not being, if you want to design things or be a podcaster or be a writer, of course, by all means, try to do it as well as is meaningful for you. It's the idea that only by being the best at something can you pursue that thing. It's only by being the best at something do you have some kind of role or purpose in society. And if not, you're kind of a failure. You're kind of left out. You didn't make it. You're stuck in the middle. It's not a good thing. That greatness is meant to be the kind of goal. And even if you don't subscribe to that worldview, you live within it, right? So even if you don't think, okay, I have to be the best, you're still looking at a system where people who have that kind of competitive edge are being propelled into positions of power, often extreme power, whether that's within a particular field or a country or an economy. Mm-hmm. And so opposing that, again, not to just doing things well, but to this kind of system of ranking, this sort of idea that, who we are depends on where we fit in an order. And that, I think, actually takes away our pursuits of excellence, because the things that we might be good at might be caring for each other, or being decent to each other, mm-hmm. Or being a high school football coach, whatever it might be that you're just kind of good at in a certain way that you lose touch with because you think, oh no, but I've got to make a lot of money, I've got to survive, I've got to be part of something really big and so forth. Or even if you're not thinking that, again, the pressure's on you. I would see this a lot with my students, which I think is also where this came from, who would say to me, I don't want to get a job at a bank. I don't want to go into consulting. I want to, do something that feels really meaningful. But if I want to buy a home, if I want to have kids, if I want to save for retirement, I can't exist in this unless I try to really kind of excel in my field and the economy and science and so forth. And I didn't want to oppose that to just sort of giving up or feeling like you're middling. I want to think about what that really meant. And I found that or what kind of other value system could be offered. And I found it, I think, in an interesting place. And I take this title, The Good Enough Life, is a kind of version of what a psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, called the good enough parent. And the idea of the good enough parent, I think, is quite beautiful. What Winnicott says is that there is a kind of parenting that strives for greatness, or what it thinks of as greatness, right? And it sort of says, I'm going to be the best parent. I'm going to do everything for my child. They're never going to be wanting. They're never going to be sad. I'm just going to go all in and they're going to have the perfect life. And what Winnicott found was that this was bad for both the child and the parent. Even if you succeeded, probably can't succeed, but even if you do succeed, it's bad for the parent because you're stressed out, you're trying to do too much, you're putting in excess energy. We all know about the burnout that so many parents are feeling. And it's bad for the child. And this is where I think it's quite interesting, is that Winnicott says part of life is learning to deal creatively with our failures and limitations, because that's just inevitable. That's part of being human. And if we're always being supported by these great parents, we're losing that capacity. So it's actually a diminution of what we're capable of and our growth as human beings. So Winnicott doesn't then, of course, just say, well, be a whatever parent, like don't show up for your kids, let them just fail and suffer and they'll figure it out. No, he says you have to be good enough. Right? You have to be decent, you have to be caring, you have to be loving, you have to be present, you have to provide the sufficient material and emotional resources that your child needs. And that's incredibly difficult. Like, good enough is not this easy thing, because you have to do this very difficult double motion, which is provide sufficiency, but also pull back. That moment when you're the parent and you see your kids struggling, you see your love, if you don't have children, you see your partner or your friend struggling, you don't just fix the problem for them, right? You kind of work with them, you think with them, you hold yourself back a little bit. You don't try and make everything perfect. And that can be also quite hard, because when you see someone you care about suffering, of course you want to take away the tears or the pain or what have you. And so it's that real challenge of the good enough life. And then I thought about how that really expanded out. It wasn't simply parenting that functioned in that way, but it was lots of situations in society where instead of trying to rush ahead and fix everything, if we actually listen to each other, if we really sort of say, okay, what are the different ideas or positions here? How does everyone in the situation have a good enough contribution? And how can we have a system that, though not perfect, not everyone's going to get what they want all the time, there's going to be competing interests, of course, we can all have a kind of good enough input, a good enough relationship to that society. That, I think, is much more the solution, and that, I think, builds on Winnicott's foundational ideas.
Yeah, I certainly relate to the parenting part of this, which is it's real, right? And I've read part of that book, and I didn't make the connection, the way you did, which I then, once I read your book, it made a lot of sense. It was very eye-opening. But I think what I can relate to is, and I think that's really powerful, is this: it's not easy, right? That's not a giving up. That's not a resigning. It's actually, it just requires two things, probably. One, there is another, as you said, value set attached to that. And it requires a lot of intentionality, right? It is that awareness and consciousness that you need to bring to every moment, essentially, to find that balance that you're describing. And that in itself is actually a real skill to build, and then scaling it out into either organizations or into societies. And that collective skill is probably incredibly hard to build, especially given what we are now have been conditioned to for a long time. So that's really profound. I have a lot of questions for you, and I took a lot of pieces out of the book. So one of I guess pushbacks, which you also kind of outlined in your anecdote from Hamburg, is often this: well, but that but if I do this, right? If I follow this new, let's say, philosophy, if I try to this new approach in business or in society, then my company will die, or my product will not sell, or as a society we will fall behind. At the same time, I think what you do really well in the book is you use a lot of really powerful data points to say, look, we are the wealthiest we've ever been. We are the most productive we've ever been as humanity. And yet so many of us are disconnected, dying, hungry. When we're looking at the planet getting hotter, we know it's not working. How do we reconcile, or how do you think about reconciling those clear facts, right? And on top of that, also over the long arc of humanity, we have been getting better, right? There's Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, that talks about how when we're looking at child mortality, for example, we have been getting better. How do we reconcile all of those? I think you mentioned it somewhere. You call it the fundamental paradox of our present condition. How do you think about that? How do we move into meaningful dialogue, right? Because all of it is so polarized, and it's either or all the time. It's black and white, 1 or 0, binary. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. And I think one thing, though, is to begin with the recognition that we can. And at a fundamental level, I think there is a hold on our imagination sometimes. And we sort of think, because these things have because childhood mortality, infant mortality has decreased, because lifespans have increased, because general wealth has increased. I mean, we have all sorts of amazing technologies. We sort of say, oh, well, it must be because of all the bad stuff. We almost make this a kind of implicit thing. For some people to live well, other people simply can't. And other people, that'll be different in another generation. And that's kind of how the world works. And again, I think it's that kind of thinking that business itself sets out to undo. The whole point of business is to sort of say, just because it's been done this way before, it doesn't mean we have to keep doing that way. We can do it differently. But it's also to recognize that the types of advantages that we have also come from things like energy sources, right? Sometimes we sort of say, well, it's because of inequality that we're able to advance technology and some people have access to it and then it gets better for everyone. But it's also true, and the number isn't fresh in my head, but Václav Smil, the kind of historian of energy systems, physicist of energy systems, goes through this and says effectively on average, and every adult has something like the equivalent of 40 people working for them around the clock just through the power of oil and gas. And for some people, that's zero, right? And for some people, that's several thousands, depending on where you are in the income and your access to these things. But we should remember that so much of what has advanced all these things, the facts that we see, is the discovery of new sources of energy and power. And that using those differently, distributing those differently, finding clean energy, or not even finding, we know how to do it, right? But just sort of implementing it would do another revolutionary leap for us. And in fact, expanding access to these things. If there's only a certain amount of energy, people don't need 2,000 people working for them around the clock. I have an amazing life, and I have whatever the Smilnian equivalent of 40 people. I mean, it's wild, right? What we're able to accomplish simply through these things. And so that would actually be an amazing advance to have more general availability of something like energy resources. And we, again, know how to do it. But like you said, there's polarization, there's locked in things. So I think one thing is just advancing our imagination by advancing our understanding. How did we get here? What got us here? And it is not simply the best that got us here, right? A lot of this was people working together. One of the examples that I like in the book as a kind of example for cooperation, and I don't go into it in so much detail, but there's a moment in 1941 when the world's rubber supply is dominated by the Japanese, mostly in Southeast Asia. Japan has sort of taken over Southeast Asia. And they're able, this is a moment when you can't fight a war without rubber. I mean, rubber is the essential, one of the essential components for this war. And the United States realizes we need to be able to make synthetic rubber. We no longer have access to the natural thing. They had not been able to do it. And lots of chemists in lots of different places had been kind of tinkering at little parts and little pieces, and no one had ever really managed to have a breakthrough. And then they got involved as a society and basically said, look, we need to make this advance as soon as possible. No more of this. This business works on that. This scientist works on that. We are working together. And everyone's going to put in all hands effort. And within 9 months, they were producing enough rubber to continue that they didn't have at all previously, or just little bits. Not because of competition, not because of dividing people up, but because of people coming together and thinking, this is what we need to do. How can we do this? And we forget, I think, sometimes little examples like this where it is because we stop doing the kind of competitive thing. We start doing the working together thing. And that's where a lot of our advances come from. How do you do that day to day? Like, how do you do that to break through polarization? I think at some level, it's just long and slow and difficult work of talking to people and also listening to people, right? And really just sort of, I think, there is a lot that can be accomplished if politicians who have a general interest at heart, business leaders who have a general interest at heart, people who really do care about the decency and well-being of the whole society, don't presume that they have the answers, don't presume that they know what everybody needs, and do convenings, bring people together, talk to them, listen to people who are feeling really frustrated and why, and don't blame them. Don't say, well, you didn't study hard enough, you didn't advance enough. Understand what are their conditions. These kinds of things that we don't think of as politics or social change, I think can matter quite a bit. And I think when you see, but part of my evidence here is simply when you see a politician who says, I hear you, I recognize you, even when that person proceeds to govern in a way completely antithetical to that, doesn't care at all about working class issues, is entirely working on some big corruption scheme or what have you, that works, right? People care because it's so meaningful to have someone say, hey, I hear you, I listen to you, I care about you. And I think that kind of work can really add to that. So, sorry, it's a bit of a rambling answer because I don't have a simple solution, but I think that by understanding kind of what the conditions are for our improvement, understanding how working together can be really helpful, and just doing the hard daily work of engaging with each other, it's not going to change overnight, but it lays the groundwork for these kinds of transformations.
Yeah. And, there is no easy answer to any of this, right? It is nuanced, it is complex, and it requires a lot of conversation, right? But what is interesting is when you go all the way down to, what's underlying it all, right? Then what's also interesting is, and I think you touch on this in many ways also in the book and your writing overall, the human condition in itself is so paradox, right? Because we are a collective species. We've always evolved as a collective. We need each other. We're social species too, right? But then again, at the same time, certain things trigger very individualistic survival mechanisms, I guess, and they are still very present, very alive in everyday situations, be that in organizations, be that in society. And, one of the reasons I call this podcast Poets and Thinkers is because I believe that we're at a point where more than ever, maybe, or certainly at a point where we will require a reminder of there are parts of our nature that can lift us out of those very individualistic, often fear, individualistic tendencies of the human nature and into the, I guess, higher level thinking that really cultivate more of the collective intelligence and the fact that we are a social species and we need to work together. And I read something, I forgot who wrote it, but it was basically along the lines of, if we have one way forward, it's basically we need to remind people of what's worth protecting, right? Of the beauty of all the things that humans can make when they come together. And I think, your anecdote from 1941 there is interesting because in these times, certainly when there's a, world war raging, there's the collective fear is probably so big that then that overpowers everything and everyone realizes, oh my God, we actually need to work together, right? So then the question is, how do we cultivate without getting into these extreme situations where it's really about the survival of, big parts of humanity, maybe not all of it. So this was a long way of setting up the question of, how do you think about this paradox of the human condition, and how can artists, intellectuals, people that can remind us of our ability to create help?
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's a good point. The one thing I really don't like about that example is that it's a war example. It requires a kind of enemy to drive people together. I'd love an example, and I think in some ways they exist post-war, right? There's lots of global institutions that develop to try to generally better the condition and avoid getting back into war situations. And I hope that we are able, as a species, to be able to remember that and rekindle and recall these moments when we see actually our destinies are linked, that it is not going to work well if we wait for catastrophe in order to figure out how to avoid the next catastrophe. We've had enough catastrophe we should have learned by now. And I hope that we rekindle some of that kind of humanitarian spirit of really caring about everyone and the world that we share, the ecology that we share. In terms of the, but I think one of the tricks that you're pointing out is it's difficult sometimes to parse what is our self-interest and what is kind of generally good. And philosophers have tried very hard to narrow the gap between those things and to really think that, self-interest is actually sort of enlightened self-interest. And if we were to act, what's best for us is in fact to improve the conditions for everybody. I think another way to think about it is that what are the conditions for my expressions of individuality? What are the social or political ways or emotional, relational ways that I can be the kind of idiosyncratic, interested person that I am? And I talked about this a little bit earlier, where we talked about how greatness sometimes occludes excellence, right? That sometimes this pursuit of kind of being at the top of something where there's only a certain recognized number of tops may stop you from doing what you're actually very good at. And so I think kind of thinking about what would you actually like to do? I mean, I think some people have this kind of hierarchical, dominative tendency. I don't think it's who they are entirely, but they have a certain tendency and it gets exacerbated. I think most people would like just to live a pretty decent life, would like not to have to work all the time, would like to be able to spend time with their family and friends and do enjoyable activities. And I think if we kind of recall that the things that we really care about are sometimes impeded by the way that we structure things, we might remember that actually our own ability, the conditions of our own ability to do the kinds of things that we care about, we find meaningful, happens best when everyone can do them. If we create conditions in which it's like, oh, it's a competition and only some of us are going to be able to do it, and then we've got to fight each other, and then we're not doing the thing we want to do because what we're doing is fighting each other. If we create conditions where actually everyone, wait, how do I make it work so that if you want to do a podcast and someone else does too, we can have you know what I mean? Like we can kind of grow the possibilities and capacities. Even if that means not everyone's going to listen all the time, that's okay. Right. But we still have meaningful conversations as part of it. So I think it's hard though sometimes to put those moments together when the world doesn't feel that way. And as much as we can to think politically, think socially, think relationally, what can we do? What kinds of things would we like to see our leaders talk about? What kinds of things can we as leaders in our communities or our groups do? And I mean, to give it just a tiny example from, I was talking earlier about how I think, you know, sometimes good writers or artists may get excluded in their own field. One thing is if you are a person who's having a lot of success, make sure to, if you're invited to give a talk, invite someone along with you, right? Bring someone in who you know is really smart and talented, but isn't getting as much recognition. Have them be a part of it. Or if you're an artist who's offered a show, don't say, great, that's mine, right? But, oh, I know like 2 other people who are really doing good work. I think it would all work together. And this does happen, and it's really beautiful to see. I mean, I don't exactly know what that would look like in business or design, but I think that would be a really interesting question for people. What can you do when you're having a bit of success if you don't think this is exactly, if your success is blocking out some space from other people, how can you bring them in as opposed to how can you get to that next, how can I make the next million or billion or whatever, or how can I have that next show or that next book or that next, you know, famous lecture circuit? Like, how can you kind of bring people in? It's really hard to do, but it is something that we do have some control over, right, in our immediate spheres.
Yeah, and can make, especially in times of like really massive multi-crisis situation, can actually make a really meaningful difference in having these small but very meaningful acts. And kind of, you know, it brings me back or toward my last question I had for you, which also touches on something you already said earlier, you know, about collective intelligence and just a realization that it is in fact not true that there's this myth of the individual genius, right, that we're holding on to when it comes to greatness. And in turn, you had a quote in a book from Donald Justice, great ironic last name there. There's a randomness in the operation of the laws of fame that approaches the chaotic. So, you know, looking at all of that, the one question I had for you is, you know, we're looking at where we are today and everything we've just talked about, and probably could talk about for hours. What are the qualities of leaders, and I'm saying just leaders in general, that can lead us into a good enough future? How do we get there?
Yeah, I think one place is to start with the recognition. I mean, so Justice is a poet, and in that context, he's trying to understand how a number of wonderful writers that he kind of came of age with, some of them just disappeared, and some didn't. Some became very successful, and some were never read. And he looks at the poems themselves, the quality of the poems kind of as a critic and as a poet. And he just says, I cannot tell you. And I can say as someone who's worked in academia, if you were to kind of take a random assortment of academics and sort of look at their work and the quality of their work, regardless of the kind of metrics of citations and such things, but just the work itself, you would have no idea how you could sort of say this person is the most, like the work itself almost never sometimes you have these geniuses who are just Einsteins, but that is really the exception rather than the rule, and it is the wrong metric by which to kind of judge in general. There are so many people who are able to contribute and offer something. And again, that starting there, having people sort of recognize, look, we have built a world that sort of says it's all about merit, it's all about your credentials, it's all about being excellent, and that's how you get success. And that's a good thing. That's the thing that works for the rest of us. To flip that and sort of say it's all about caring for each other. It's all about being decent. It's all about caring for the planet. It's all about doing all the things that we actually recognize. I know it sounds utopian when I say this, but if you think about, right, when you talk to people, what do they say they really want or care about? It's mostly like decency, quality, time with people that they care about, doing activities that are meaningful for them. I don't think many 5-year-olds say, what I really want is a first-class flight and a 5-star hotel in Tahiti. It's like I want more time with mommy and daddy, right? Like it's these kinds of things. And I think kind of appealing to that is, it stays with, it's not just a 5-year-old. It's like who we
That's
are,
right.
who we become, and really having someone be willing to take a stand and not sort of say, oh, you earned it, you're the most successful, you're the best, but just sort of say, like, how could you, who's very successful, or you who has, other kinds of successes in life, other moments of well-being, how can we all be part of a society together and have this be really meaningful? I don't know. Like, I'm not a politician, so I don't do it. But in my heart of hearts, I have to believe that a charismatic person or a charismatic movement or something that really kind of says, what do we want from life? And are our politics delivering that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do we know? Do you care about a great leader, or do you care about having your voice heard and participating? Do you care about the opportunity to become rich and lord over other people, or do you care about the opportunity to live in a community where everyone is doing well, and so you don't need to fear for your own safety or your own well-being? There's no one coming after you. We're all kind of working supportively. I have to believe that there is a way to channel that decency within people. And I think we talked about this, we touched on this a little bit in terms of thinking about our evolution and our biology, and remembering that both of these tendencies exist with us. It's sometimes talked about by primatologists as kind of chimps versus bonobos. I mean, the analogy may not be perfect, but it used to be thought that, chimps were more aggressive, bonobos were more kind of peaceful, egalitarian. It turns out bonobos are also a little complicated, and chimps probably aren't as mean as we think. In any case, we have kind of elements of both of those possibilities within us. And it's not about sort of saying we're going to like tame human nature and force everyone to do something nice for each other. Because we're saying actually part of our human nature is really wanting to be decent to each other. And we're going to try and bring that out. That's really going to be our goal as a society. And what does that look like? And I don't think it's utopian, because I think at some fundamental level, what does utopia mean, right? Literally, I mean, it means two things. It's a pun, and it means both a place that doesn't exist and a good place. And I think the kind of meaning here is that if we keep living the way that we're living, with the aggression, with the anger, with the buildup of war, with the ecological catastrophe, and with the isolation and the unnecessary deaths and the unnecessary suffering, this is leading us to utopia in the sense of a non-place. We're just not going to be able to continue existing. And there is another option, which is utopia as a good place, and actually doing this decent thing. That's not utopian in the bad sense. That's utopian in the positive sense. That good place is what keeps us going, is what keeps us alive. And just kind of to remember that, to recall that the things that we sometimes think are more realistic may actually be the things that are driving our destruction, and the things that may sound a bit more, oh, let's just be nice for each other. Maybe that's really where it's at, and maybe that's where we can kind of push those values and think about what it would mean to live in a world where everyone is respected, heard, has some egalitarian ways of living, so that we're all able to have enough, but not too much, not take too much from the world, but be able to contribute what we can. Maybe that's not so crazy as it sounds.
And that's a perfect way to wrap it. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time, Avi. This was inspiring and exactly, I think hits a lot of really important points. So thank you for the time. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I hope to have many more conversations with you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and for making this podcast where people can have these kinds of conversations. It's really wonderful.
Thank you. All right, that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for listening to Poets and Thinkers. If you like this episode, make sure you hit follow and subscribe to get the latest episodes wherever you listen to your podcast.